Sylva's breath, a wild witch, becomes the village's lifeline. Winter's teeth bit deep into the ridge that night, carving wind-sharp furrows across stone and bark, while Sylva Thorn moved like shadow through the tree line. Her breath came in measured plumes, not the quick puffs of prey, but the steady rhythm of a predator reading the world through scent and pressure. Each footfall whispered against frozen earth as she tracked the hare's path, her pale eyes catching moonlight like chips of ice. The wolf mother padded beside her, silver-furred and massive, her amber gaze sweeping the darkness with ancient patience. Nyx had found Sylva 7 winters past, a half-frozen child stumbling through a blizzard with frost in her hair and death rattling her lungs. Now they moved as one entity, 2 hearts, 2 sets of senses, one understanding of the world's hidden language. There, Sylva breathed, her voice barely more than wind through pine needles. The hare crouched beneath a hawthorn's twisted roots, its pulse drumming against her ears like a tiny war drum. She clicked her tongue once, a sound learned from Nyx's throat song, and the prey froze, mesmerized by the alien music. The kill came swift and clean. Sylva's blade found the gap between vertebrae with surgical precision, ending the creature's terror before it could fully bloom. Blood steamed against the snow, and she offered the first taste to Nyx before cracking the long bones to share the rich marrow within. This was their covenant hunter and hunted, teacher and student, the endless cycle that kept them both alive through the starving months. Dawn's first light found them at the ice bridge, where the creek narrowed between 2 boulders and winter had built a treacherous span of frozen water. Sylva knelt at the edge, pressing her ear to the surface, listening for the hollow ring that warned of weakness beneath. The ice sang its secrets in groans and whispers, here solid as stone, there ready to shatter like glass. She taught herself this language through necessity. 3 seasons ago, she'd broken through near-solid ice and nearly drowned in the black water below. Listen first, she murmured to herself, the words becoming ritual, becoming prayer. Her fingers traced the surface, feeling for the subtle give that meant danger. The creek below moved fast enough to carve caverns beneath the ice, creating death traps for the unwary. But Sylva had learned to read water's moods, to sense the current's hungry pull through touch and sound. At midday, she ghosted through the hedge that bordered the village lands, her winter cloak mottled gray and brown to blend with bare branches. The trader's post sat isolated from the main settlement, a deliberate choice, for those who dealt in pelts often carried more than animal fur in their transactions. Sylva waited until the man's back was turned, then slipped 3 rabbit skins onto his counter and took the small cloth pouch of salt he left in return. No words passed between them. No eyes met. She was shadow and rumor, a story whispered by the fire but never confirmed in daylight. The village bells tolled noon as she melted back into the wild, their bronze voices carrying warnings she refused to hear. Those bells meant community, warmth, shared bread, and common purpose, all the things that stood opposite to her nature. She was the space between heartbeats, the pause between breaths. To enter their world would mean losing herself in their noise and light. That evening brought the boar. Sylva smelled it first-rank musk and old blood, the signature of a creature driven mad by winter's privations. It crashed through the underbrush toward the spring where she'd come to drink, its small eyes red with hunger and territorial rage. A massive thing, thick as a tree trunk and twice as mean, with tusks yellow as old bone and breath that reeked of carrion. She had perhaps 3 heartbeats to act. The deadfall trap she'd rigged 2 days prior sat 20 paces north, a heavy log suspended by rope and trigger stick, waiting for unwary prey. But the boar charged straight for her, foam speckling its snout, and she knew she'd never reach the trap in time. So Sylva did what wolves do when faced with larger predators. She lied. Her body shifted left while her scent moved right, a trick learned from watching Nyx hunt deer through deep snow. She grabbed a handful of mud and dead leaves, flinging it to create a false trail, then rolled beneath a fallen pine and held her breath. The boar's rage-clouded mind followed the deception, charging toward the phantom scent while Sylva slipped behind it like a whisper. The creature hit the deadfall's trigger with the force of a battering ram. The log dropped with a sound like thunder, crushing the boar's spine in an instant. It thrashed once, squealed, then lay still, steam rising from its blood-matted hide. Sylva stood slowly, her hands shaking not from fear but from the intoxicating rush of a plan perfectly executed. This was her nature, not the raw power of fang and claw, but the patient intelligence that turned an enemy's strength against itself. She was guardian and strategist, protector of this small corner of the world through cunning rather than force. As she field-dressed the boar by starlight, sharing the liver with Nyx while the rest would feed them for a week, Sylva felt the first stirrings of something larger than hunger. The village bells had fallen silent, but their bronze voices seemed to echo still in the valley's depths. Somewhere beyond the ridge, humans moved through their own rituals of survival, facing their own winter demons. She pushed the thought away. Her world was wild and free, bounded by ridge and stream, populated by creatures who spoke in scent and sound rather than words. The village and its complications remained a distant constellation, bright but untouchable, as foreign as the stars themselves. The hammering started before dawn, metal ringing against stone in rhythms that made Nyx's ears flat against her skull. From their den on the eastern ridge, Sylva watched smoke rise from the village center, black and acrid with the smell of hot pitch. They were rebuilding the well again. The old stone shaft had been crumbling for months, its walls weeping mineral tears that spoke of deeper structural failures. Through her spyglass, scavenged from a long-dead explorer's pack, she observed the work crews descending into the earth with ropes and determination. The wellwright, a grizzled man named Cornelius Blackwater, directed the operation with the authority of someone who'd spent his life coaxing water from stubborn ground. His hands moved in precise gestures as he explained the shaft's architecture to younger workers, mapping the underground chambers with the confidence of long experience. But the villagers moved with nervous energy that had nothing to do with their labor. Conversations died when certain names were mentioned. Children were called inside when shadows grew long, and always, their eyes turned toward the ridge where Sylva watched from her hidden perch. The stories had been growing like infection through the village's bloodstream, each telling more lurid than the last. She'd heard fragments during her rare trading visits, whispered conversations that ceased when she approached, words scattered like leaves in wind. Pale-eyed witch. Steals children's breath. Calls the wolves to hunt human flesh. Truth had become clay in their hands, molded by fear into shapes that bore no resemblance to reality. The woman who shared her fire with an orphaned wolf became a sorceress who commanded packs of supernatural beasts. The hunter who took only what she needed became a creature that gorged on human suffering. They needed someone to blame for their troubles, and Sylva, strange, solitary, never quite human in their eyes, served that need perfectly. Davin Thornwick, the ambitious young hunter who'd recently returned from the capital with grand ideas about proper wilderness management, had become the most vocal voice in these accusations. He spoke with the authority of education and city backing, claiming knowledge of unnatural predation patterns and corrupted wildlife behavior. Every missing chicken, every cow found dead of bloat, every failed harvest became evidence in his growing case against the den witch who haunted their borders. "I've seen the signs," he proclaimed at the tavern one night, his voice carrying clearly to where Sylva crouched in the hedge outside. Claw marks where no natural animal could reach, tracks that appear and vanish like smoke. This creature threatens everything we've built here. The other men nodded, their ale-loosened tongues eager for simple explanations to complex problems. Old Henrik's prize bull had died 2 days past, not from any supernatural curse, but from eating moldy grain in his poorly maintained storehouse. Yet when Henrik found scratches on his barn door, left by nothing more sinister than a raccoon seeking spilled oats, Davin was quick to point out the unnatural spacing of the marks. Fear became its own creature in the village, feeding on itself and growing stronger with each retelling. Mothers sang different lullabies now, warning children to stay close to home, lest the pale-eyed woman steal their dreams. Farmers installed new locks on their coops and painted protective symbols on their doors, iron nails driven in cross patterns, bundles of sage hung from rafters, circles of salt scattered around thresholds. The transformation wounded Sylva in ways she hadn't expected. These people had never welcomed her, but neither had they actively hunted her. Now she felt their hatred like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders whenever she moved through their territory. The simple act of trading pelts for salt became an exercise in stealth and timing, avoiding not just detection, but the possibility of violence. Yet something else drew her to watch them, a longing she refused to name but couldn't entirely suppress. One night, hidden in the hawthorn hedge that bordered the village green, she witnessed a wedding celebration that seemed to pulse with all the warmth her own life lacked. The bride and groom danced beneath strings of lanterns, while musicians played melodies that made her chest ache with unnamed hunger. Children ran between the tables, laughing with the careless joy of creatures who'd never known true solitude. Elders shared stories that wove the past into the present, creating continuity that stretched beyond any single life. When the flute player began a particularly haunting melody, Sylva found herself unconsciously trilling in harmony, a sound learned from evening birds but shaped by human longing. For a moment, the music seemed to bridge the gap between her world and theirs, creating a connection that transcended the barriers of fear and misunderstanding. Then a child spotted her pale eyes gleaming in the hedge and screamed, shattering the spell. The celebration ground to a halt as adults grabbed for weapons and children were swept behind protective walls of flesh and fabric. Sylva fled into the darkness, her heart hammering with embarrassment and loss, while behind her Davin's voice rose above the chaos. "You see, the den witch prowls among us even now, drawn by the scent of joy and innocence." That night marked the end of her subtle observations. Guards were posted at the village perimeter. Hunting parties ranged farther into the wild lands, seeking signs of her presence. The tolerant indifference that had allowed her to exist on the margins of their world had curdled into active hostility. But the earth itself was stirring beneath their feet, preparing to render all human conflicts meaningless. The Wellwright's tools rang against stone with increasing desperation as underground chambers shifted and settled. Ancient supports groaned under pressures they were never designed to bear. Water tables dropped and surged according to rhythms that spoke of deeper instabilities. Sylva felt the changes in her bones, subtle vibrations that traveled through bedrock, the way sound carried through a wolf pack's territory. Nyx whined and paced at night, her wild instincts reading warnings in the earth's trembling voice. Something vast and patient was awakening beneath the village, something that cared nothing for human politics or supernatural fears. The stage was set for catastrophe, with all the players willing and unwilling moving toward a convergence that would test every bond of community, fear, and misunderstood loyalty. In the darkness before dawn, as hammers rang and hatred festered, the earth prepared to open its throat and swallow the structures humans had built above its hidden chambers. The scream of rending stone cut through the night like a blade through silk, jerking Sylva from sleep with the violence of a physical blow. She rolled from her bedroll as the ridge trembled beneath her, loose rocks cascading down the slope in miniature avalanches, while Nyx howled her distress to the uncaring stars. The village square had become a wound in the earth. Where the well had stood for 3 generations, a jagged mouth now gaped open to reveal chambers that should never have seen starlight. Steam rose from the depths, carrying the mineral taste of deep water and the acrid smell of pulverized stone. The carefully fitted stones that had lined the well shaft lay scattered like broken teeth, while timbers and support beams jutted from the hole at impossible angles. 3 workers had been in the shaft when it collapsed 2 young men and the Wellwright himself, Cornelius Blackwater. Their screams had died with the initial cave-in, swallowed by the earth's hungry maw along with ropes, tools, and 20 feet of carefully constructed stonework. Now only dust and silence rose from the pit, thick as fog and twice as choking. The first rescue attempt came within minutes. Henrik Greystone, whose bull had died the week before, rigged a rope around his waist and descended into the chaos with a lamp clutched in his trembling fist. He made it perhaps 15 feet before the secondary collapse began, a grinding rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth's very bones. "Pull him up," someone screamed. "The whole thing's coming down." But Henrik was already climbing, his boots scraping against loose stone as debris rained around him. He reached the surface with blood streaming from a dozen cuts, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a man who'd stared into an abyss and found it staring back. "Can't reach them," he gasped, accepting a cup of water with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Shafts blocked solid 20 feet down, but I heard." He paused, listening to something only he could perceive. "I heard breathing, faint but breathing." Hope and despair warred across the faces of the gathered villagers. 3 men trapped in a stone tomb, with tons of unstable earth between them and salvation. Every attempt to dig would risk bringing down more of the chamber system. Every moment of delay meant less air for the buried men to breathe. Then, carried on a thread of cold air that seemed to rise from the depths themselves, came the sound that changed everything. A child's cough, weak but unmistakably alive. Sylva heard it from the ridge, that fragile human sound threading through the night air like a silver wire connecting her world to theirs. Every hunting instinct she possessed locked onto that whisper of distress, reading its timbre and frequency the way she might analyze a wounded animal's cry. Not one of the adult workers, their voices would be deeper, more resonant. This was something smaller, more vulnerable. Young Thomas Millwright, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The mason's apprentice, barely 14 and eager to prove himself worthy of his craft. He must have been carrying tools or water when the collapse began, caught in the wrong place when the earth decided to reclaim its own. Without conscious thought, she began moving down the ridge, her feet finding the dear paths that would bring her to the village's edge in minutes rather than hours. Nyx whined and tried to follow, but Sylva gestured her back with sharp authority. Whatever waited in that stone grave, it was a human problem requiring human solutions. The hedge provided perfect cover as she observed the rescue efforts. A dozen men clustered around the pit's edge, their faces mask-like in the wavering torchlight. Ropes lay coiled and useless beside piles of excavation tools that no one dared employ. The ground around the wellhead had cracked in a spider's web pattern, each fissure speaking of deeper structural failures waiting to cascade. Davin Thornwick stood apart from the others, his hunter's instincts apparently focused on the wrong sort of prey. "This is her doing," he proclaimed, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd found an explanation that satisfied his prejudices. "The den witch has cursed our waters, turned the very earth against us. We should have driven her off months ago." "Shut your mouth, Thornwick." Henrik's voice cut through the night with the authority of exhaustion and recent terror. "There's men dying down there, and all you can do is chase phantoms and old wives' tales." But Davin pressed on, feeding the crowd's need for someone to blame. "Look at the cracks, the way they spiral outward like some unnatural curse. No simple cave-in creates patterns like these. She's been working her foul magic beneath our feet, weakening the foundations of everything we've built." Several voices murmured agreement, fear making them hungry for simple explanations to incomprehensible catastrophe. The same people who'd been dancing at a wedding 3 days ago now stood ready to believe that supernatural malice had torn their world apart. Sylva felt their hatred like a physical force, pressing against her chest with each accusation. Then Thomas coughed again, the sound weaker than before but carrying clearly through the night air. Sylva stepped from the hedge. The response was immediate and electric. Hands reached for weapons, while children were pulled behind protective barriers of adult flesh. Davin's voice rose in triumphant vindication. "You see, the creature comes to gloat over her handiwork." "I come to help," Sylva said simply, her pale eyes reflecting torchlight as she approached the pit's edge. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by predators and prey alike. "That child will die if we stand here arguing about curses and blame." "Help," Davin laughed, the sound harsh as breaking glass. "You mean to finish what your dark arts started. I say we bind her and—" His words cut off as Thomas coughed again, followed by a man's voice, Cornelius Blackwater, calling weakly for water and light. The sound of living humans trapped in a stone coffin rendered all other concerns momentarily irrelevant. Old Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face grim with pragmatism born of hard experience. "Can you reach them, girl?" he asked, ignoring the shocked murmurs of his neighbors. "Can you bring our people home?" Sylva nodded toward the pit, reading the collapse patterns with eyes trained to track wounded animals through dense forest. "The main shaft is blocked, but sound carries strangely. There are side chambers, hidden passages. The earth here is old, riddled with caverns that predate your foundations." "And how would you know such things?" Davin demanded, his hand resting on his knife hilt with obvious intent. "Unless you helped create this trap in the first place." Instead of answering, Sylva knelt at the pit's edge and pressed her ear to the stone. The technique was one learned from Nyx, the way wolves listened for prey moving through burrows, reading the earth's acoustic signature to map invisible spaces. Here, she heard the subtle echoes that spoke of hollow chambers, the faint movement of air through cracks too narrow for human eyes to detect. "There," she whispered, pointing to a section of cracked ground 30 feet north of the main collapse. "The breathing comes from there, underneath the granary's foundation. There's a passage, natural stone, probably carved by an underground stream centuries ago." Henrik followed her gaze, his builder's eyes assessing angles and possibilities. "If you're right, we could dig down from the surface, create a new access point without disturbing the main collapse." He paused, studying her with the careful attention of someone reassessing a fundamental assumption. "If you're lying, we waste precious time while good men die." "I don't lie about death," Sylva replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd killed to survive and never forgotten the cost. "That child's breath grows weaker with each moment we delay. Choose quickly." The silence stretched like a bowstring as the village faced its first real test of collective character. Fear warred with hope, prejudice with pragmatism, while beneath their feet 3 human beings counted their remaining breaths in the darkness. The descent began with rope and prayer, 2 commodities in which the village found itself surprisingly well supplied. Henrik had rigged a pulley system using the granary's loading beam, creating mechanical advantage that would allow them to haul materials and eventually people from the depths below. The excavation had taken 3 hours of desperate digging, following Sylva's guidance to a natural chimney that dropped 20 feet through limestone and clay before opening into the buried chamber system. Cornelius Blackwater's voice reached them first weak but lucid, carrying the particular clarity that came from staring death in the face and finding it wanting. "Rope signals," he called up through the narrow shaft. "1 pull means send down supplies. 2 pulls means haul up. 3 means emergency, get out fast." Sylva absorbed the information with the quick intelligence of someone accustomed to learning survival techniques on the first attempt. But she offered her own knowledge in return, demonstrating the clicking sounds she used to navigate in complete darkness, a technique learned from cave-dwelling creatures who'd never seen sunlight. "Echolocation," she explained to Henrik, who was preparing to make the first descent with medical supplies. "Click with your tongue, listen for the response. Solid stone sounds different from loose earth. Moving air creates echoes that still air cannot. You can map a space without seeing it." The old builder nodded thoughtfully, storing the information with the careful attention of someone who'd survived decades of dangerous work by learning from every available source. "And this?" he asked, producing a long crow feather from his pack. "Draft detection," Sylva replied immediately. "Tie it to a string, lower it into unknown spaces. Air movement will bend the feather, show you which passages lead to the surface and which dead end in collapsed stone." They worked together at the shaft's edge, 2 unlikely teachers sharing techniques born from different worlds, but united by common purpose. Henrik contributed the knowledge of conventional excavation, how to brace unstable timber, how to read the stress patterns in cracked stone, how to move tons of debris without triggering secondary collapses. Sylva offered the wisdom of the wild, how to read air currents, how to move silently through unfamiliar terrain, how to sense danger through subtle changes in sound and smell. The first successful rescue came within an hour of establishing communication. Marcus Stonefield, the youngest of the trapped workers, had suffered a broken arm and minor head trauma, but remained conscious and mobile. Henrik descended with a makeshift stretcher, while Sylva managed the rope system above, her hunter's strength and coordination proving invaluable for the delicate work of hauling an injured man through a narrow chimney. "Thank you," Marcus whispered as they lifted him from the shaft, his eyes finding Sylva's face in the torchlight. The simple words carried weight beyond their syllables, the acknowledgement of debt between strangers, the recognition of shared humanity despite all artificial barriers. But success carried its own price. The act of removing Marcus had disturbed the chamber's delicate equilibrium, causing a section of ceiling to sag ominously. Cornelius's voice reached them through the shaft, tight with new worry. "The support beams cracked. Whole sections ready to come down. We need proper bracing before anyone else moves." Sylva studied the shaft opening with the same intensity she brought to tracking wounded prey. The limestone showed stress fractures that spoke of immense pressures building in the hidden chambers below. Every rope pull, every shifted weight, risked triggering the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. I'll go, she said simply, already stripping off her heavy cloak and checking the knots on her borrowed rope harness. I'm smallest, lightest, less likely to trigger another collapse. Davin Thornwick, who had remained ominously quiet during the rescue efforts, finally found his voice again. You're not going down there. For all we know, this is exactly what you planned. Get inside their defenses, finish what you started with your cursed magic. Several villagers murmured agreement, their fear and exhaustion making them susceptible to simple explanations for complex problems. But Henrik stepped between Sylva and her accusers, his weathered face set in lines of absolute determination. I've watched this girl work for 4 hours now, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of honest labor. I've seen her share knowledge that saved Marcus's life, seen her risk her own neck for people who have done nothing but curse her name. If she's planning treachery, she's got a damned strange way of going about it. The crowd stirred uneasily, caught between their prejudices and the evidence of their own eyes. Thomas coughed again from the depths, weaker than before, and the sound cut through their debate like a blade through silk. Decide quickly, Sylva said, already securing the rope around her waist with knots learned from watching Nyx manipulate prey with teeth and claws. That child's time grows short, and arguing serves no one but the earth that wants to claim them all. The descent began with her feet against limestone and prayer on her lips, not to any god she could name, but to the patient spirits of stone and water who'd shaped this place long before humans came to disturb its sleep. The shaft narrowed as Sylva descended, limestone walls closing around her like a throat preparing to swallow. Her torch cast dancing shadows that turned familiar ropework into writhing serpents, while the echo of her breathing created phantom voices in the darkness ahead. 20 feet down, the natural chimney opened into a chamber large enough to stand upright, its floor littered with debris from the collapse above. Cornelius Blackwater waited in the farthest corner, his weathered face drawn with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes sharp with the particular alertness of someone who'd spent his life working in dangerous places. Young Thomas Millwright lay beside him, conscious but pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. Thank God, the old Wellwright whispered as Sylva's torchlight found them. Thought for sure you were another cave-in starting up. His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd been shouting for help until his throat gave out. Sylva moved carefully across the unstable floor, reading the debris patterns with eyes trained to track wounded animals through dense underbrush. Broken timber and shattered stone told the story of catastrophic structural failure, not the gradual settling that might have been survivable, but the sudden collapse that spoke of fundamental weaknesses in the chamber's design. The boy needs water, Cornelius continued, gesturing toward Thomas with hands that shook from exhaustion and shock. Been unconscious most of the time, but when he wakes, he asks for his mother. The simple words carried weight beyond their meaning, the acknowledgement that they might all die here, buried in stone and darkness while their families waited above. Sylva shared her water skin, supporting Thomas's head while he drank in careful sips. The child's pulse fluttered against her fingers like a caged bird, too fast and irregular for someone his age. Internal injuries, possibly, or simply the body's response to trauma and fear. There, she said, pointing toward a section of wall where her torch revealed a darker shadow among the stones. Feel that? Moving air coming from behind the rock face. There's another passage, probably connects to the surface somewhere beyond the collapse zone. Cornelius followed her gesture, his builder's instincts immediately grasping the implications. Natural cave system, most likely. These limestone formations are riddled with water-carved tunnels. Problem is, how do we know it leads up instead of down? The question proved prophetic. When they managed to shift enough debris to create an opening, warm air flowed out instead of the cold draft that would indicate a surface connection. Sylva squeezed through the gap first, torch held high to illuminate what lay beyond. The passage opened into a larger chamber, its floor submerged beneath 3 feet of dark water that reflected her torchlight like black mirror. The air tasted of minerals and decay, not the clean scent of flowing streams, but the stagnant breath of water that had been trapped underground for decades. Worse, the water level was rising, fed by springs disturbed by the collapse above. No good, she called back through the opening. Flooded sump, no visible exit, and the water's coming up fast. Behind her, she heard Cornelius cursing with the creative fluency of someone who'd spent his career dealing with uncooperative geology. But his words carried a new edge of desperation that spoke of options running out and time growing short. Above ground, the situation had deteriorated with similar speed. Davin Thornwick's voice rose through the shaft opening, carrying clearly to the trapped survivors below. "I say we seal it now, before the whole square collapses. 3 lives against an entire village, the choice is obvious." Other voices joined his, fear making them susceptible to calculations that reduced human beings to numbers on a ledger. The same people who demanded rescue efforts now spoke of cutting their losses, of accepting necessary sacrifices in the name of greater good. "You want to seal that shaft, you'll have to go through me first." Henrik's voice cut through the debate with the authority of someone who'd earned his position through decades of honest labor. "There's people down there, good people who have done nothing but try to bring water to this village." But even his influence had limits when faced with collective fear. The crowd stirred restlessly, caught between loyalty to their neighbors and the primal terror of being swallowed by the earth. Every groaning timber, every settling stone, reminded them that the collapse could spread at any moment. In the flooded chamber, Sylva felt the trap closing around them with the inexorable patience of a winter storm. The water had reached her knees and showed no sign of slowing its rise. Behind her, Thomas's breathing grew more labored, while Cornelius struggled to clear debris from alternative escape routes that led nowhere. This was how death came to the unwary, not with fangs and claws, but with rising water and diminishing air, with the slow closure of options until no choice remained but acceptance. She'd seen it happen to prey animals caught in flash floods, watched them struggle until exhaustion claimed them and the current bore them away. But Sylva had survived 7 winters in the wild by refusing to accept impossibility as final verdict. Somewhere in this stone maze, there had to be a passage they'd missed, a connection to the surface that previous explorers had overlooked. The air had to go somewhere, and moving air always followed the path of least resistance toward equilibrium. She stilled her racing heart and listened not with her ears alone, but with the deeper senses learned from Nyx, the ability to read the world's subtle signatures through pressure and pulse, and the movement of forces too quiet for human perception to detect. In the black water that now reached her waist, Sylva employed the technique that had kept her alive through countless hunts. She became absolutely still, allowing her senses to expand beyond the boundaries of fear and immediate peril. Her heartbeat slowed to match Nyx's resting rhythm, while her breathing deepened into the patient cadence of a predator waiting for prey to reveal itself. The taste came first, a subtle shift in the stagnant air that spoke of different minerals, different sources. Where the chamber's atmosphere had been thick with limestone dust and decay, this new current carried hints of iron and clay, the signature of soil disturbed by recent digging. Surface air filtered through the root systems of growing things. "There," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath as she pointed toward a section of ceiling that appeared identical to every other shadow-draped stone surface. Above the hedgerow, behind the granary. The roots have found a way through old limestone, carved by centuries of root acid working through natural fissures. Cornelius studied the ceiling with the skeptical eye of someone who'd learned not to trust hope too quickly. But his builder's instincts recognized the subtle signs Sylva had detected. The way sound echoed differently in that section, the pattern of mineral stains that spoke of water movement over decades. "If you're right," he said slowly, "there's a natural chimney running from here to the surface, hidden behind tree roots and probably never mapped by any human survey." His weathered face showed the cautious optimism of someone recalculating odds that had seemed hopeless moments before. The chalk marks came out, then Cornelius's professional tools adapted for underground navigation. He traced the route they'd traveled from the main collapse, marking stress points and stable zones with symbols that would guide any future rescue attempts. Sylva contributed her own notation system clicks and scratches that indicated airflow patterns and the acoustic signatures of different stone types. Above ground, the debate had shifted toward implementation. Henrik worked the rope system with hands that showed the strain of hours spent hauling debris and managing mechanical advantage, while other villagers prepared torches and tools for what might be their final descent attempt. Thomas stirred as they prepared to move, his young eyes focusing with difficulty on Sylva's torchlit face. "Are we going to die?" he asked with the directness that children brought to questions adults preferred to avoid. "Not today," Sylva replied, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who'd made similar promises to herself during her darkest winter nights. "Today we go up." The rope ferry required precise coordination between the surface crew and the trapped survivors. Cornelius fashioned a harness from available materials, while Sylva established communication protocols using her clicking system, sounds that would carry clearly through stone and indicate safe moments for hauling versus dangerous shifts in the chamber's stability. The first lift brought Thomas to the surface, his small body easily managed by the mechanical advantage of Henrik's pulley system. The child emerged blinking in torchlight, immediately surrounded by his parents and neighbors who'd maintained their vigil through the long hours of uncertainty. Marcus followed, his broken arm properly splinted now and his head injury showing no signs of dangerous progression. 2 lives saved, proof that the rescue was possible despite the odds stacked against success. But as Cornelius prepared for his own ascent, the chamber's equilibrium finally reached its breaking point. A support beam that had been groaning under impossible pressure for hours finally snapped with the sound of thunder, dropping a section of ceiling that blocked the main passage and sealed the flooded chamber completely. Above ground, the crowd heard the impact and felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. Dust and debris fountained from the shaft opening, while the rope system transmitted shock waves that spoke of catastrophic structural failure somewhere in the depths. "The whole thing's coming down," someone screamed, and several villagers began backing away from the shaft opening as if distance could protect them from the hungry earth below. Henrik held his ground, shouting down the chimney for any response from the trapped survivors. "Blackwater, girl, can you hear me?" Silence answered him, not the temporary quiet of people catching their breath, but the absolute stillness that spoke of spaces where air no longer moved and voices no longer carried. The rope hung slack in his hands, its tension gone, no longer connected to anything living in the depths below. Water climbed past Sylva's chest now, black and patient as winter itself, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth and the metallic tang of fear. The chamber had become a slowly filling grave, its walls pressing closer as debris settled and spaces compressed under the weight of disturbed stone. Beside her, Cornelius Blackwater fought his own battle against the rising panic that came with enclosed spaces and diminishing air. His breathing had grown quick and shallow, the first stage of the terror that could kill a man faster than drowning if he let it consume his reason. "Listen to me," Sylva said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded Nyx's attention through 7 winters of shared survival. "Breathe like this, deep and slow, like you're sleeping in safe den." She demonstrated the technique learned from her wolf mother, drawing air deep into her diaphragm before releasing it in measured exhalations. The old wellwright tried to match her rhythm, his weathered hands gripping floating debris as if it could anchor him to sanity. "Can't," he gasped. "Can't breathe, walls closing in." "Not walls," Sylva corrected gently, beginning the low humming that had soothed countless frightened creatures through long winter nights. The sound resonated in the stone chamber, creating acoustic patterns that seemed to expand the space rather than confine it. "Just water, just stone, old friends, patient teachers. They won't hurt us if we don't fight them." As she hummed, memory surfaced unbidden, the winter of her 10th year, when an avalanche had buried her and Nyx beneath 8 feet of snow for 3 days. The wolf had pressed close against her, sharing body heat and breath, teaching her the patience that separated survivors from victims. Air came to those who didn't waste it on panic. Warmth belonged to creatures who conserved their energy for the moment when action became possible. "Tell me," she said to Cornelius, partly to keep him focused and partly because human voices created comfort in ways that even wolf song could not. "Tell me about the water, about how you learned to find it." The request seemed to surprise him, but talking gave his mind something other than death to consider. "Started when I was younger than that boy we saved," he began, his breathing gradually matching the rhythm she'd established. "My father could smell water through solid rock, find springs that had been hidden for centuries." His voice grew stronger as memory carried him away from their immediate peril. "He taught me to read the land's moods, to understand how water moves through stone and soil. Every formation tells a story: limestone carved by patient streams, granite split by frost and root, clay laid down by ancient seas that dried to dust before men walked these hills." Sylva nodded in the darkness, recognizing kinship in his words. "Like tracking," she murmured. "Reading signs left by creatures who passed this way before. The earth remembers everything, every storm, every drought, every change in the world above." They shared stories as the water rose past their armpits, their voices creating a cocoon of human connection in the midst of stone and darkness. Cornelius spoke of wells that had flowed for generations, of the satisfaction that came from bringing clean water to thirsty communities. Sylva described her winter beneath the snow, the way she'd mapped an entire valley system by sound and scent alone, learning to read the world through senses that civilization had forgotten. "Never thought I'd die talking to the Den Witch," Cornelius said, but his words carried no malice, only the rueful humor of someone who discovered that truth bore little resemblance to rumor. "Turns out you're just a woman who learned different lessons about staying alive." "Different teachers," Sylva agreed, thinking of Nyx's patient instruction in the arts of survival. "But same goal: stay alive, protect the ones who matter, find ways through problems that seem impossible to solve." Above them, the hidden root chimney beckoned with promises of surface air and starlight. But the gap they needed to reach had been sealed by the latest collapse, leaving them with rising water and diminishing options. Yet something in the chamber's acoustic signature suggested possibility, a resonance that spoke of connections not yet explored. "The taste has changed," Sylva observed, sampling the air with senses trained to detect the subtlest shifts in environmental conditions. "Less iron, more clay, and something else root sour, like digging through earth where trees have grown for decades." Cornelius tilted his head, following her analysis with the attention of someone who'd spent his career reading water signs. "Root acid," he said slowly. "Works on limestone like a slow chisel, creates passages too small for normal mapping but big enough for desperate people with no other choices," Sylva finished. The root chimney was still there, still connected to the surface, but accessed now through a route that would require them to become more liquid than solid, more hope than substance. The water reached their chins as they began the final phase of their escape. Not the clean heroism of surface rescues, but the muddy desperation of creatures who refused to accept death as inevitable. The root chimney revealed itself only when they pressed against the chamber's ceiling, their faces turned upward toward the promise of air that tasted of earth and growing things rather than stagnant water and crushing stone. Sylva went first, her smaller frame allowing her to navigate the narrow passage where centuries of tree roots had carved channels through solid limestone. The rope that connected her to the surface team above became a lifeline in the most literal sense, 20 feet of hemp and hope that would either carry them to safety or mark the spot where their bodies would rest until the next geological age. Henrik's voice reached them through the natural chimney, distorted but unmistakably human. "Got you both on belay. Come up steady and slow." But the limestone had other plans. As Cornelius began his ascent, his greater weight shifted debris that had been balanced in precarious equilibrium since the first collapse. The root chimney groaned and settled, narrowing the passage until rough stone scraped skin and fabric with every upward inch. "Ropes cutting through the limestone edge," Henrik called down, his voice tight with concern. "Sharp rock sawing the fibers won't hold much longer under this angle and weight." Above ground, the entire village had gathered in the hedgerow behind the granary, their torches creating a constellation of flickering light around the hawthorn tree that marked the chimney's surface terminus. Even Davin Thornwick had joined the human chain that anchored the rescue rope, his earlier hostility overwhelmed by the immediate necessity of saving lives. Cornelius felt consciousness slipping away as oxygen deprivation and exhaustion finally claimed their due. His hands loosened on the rope as his body prepared for the shutdown that would end his suffering in the depths below. But Sylva was already moving, her hunter's instincts recognizing crisis moments before reason could process the danger. She cut her own belt, leather she'd crafted from her first successful deer kill, blessed with meanings that went deeper than mere utility. The strip became an impromptu harness that she secured around Cornelius's chest before lowering herself beneath him in the narrow chimney. Her shoulders wedged against the stone walls while her arms supported his weight from below. "Pull," she screamed up the shaft, her voice carrying all the authority of someone who'd commanded wolves and weather and wild spaces where human will meant the difference between life and death. "Pull now, before the whole thing comes down." The villagers above responded with the coordinated strength of people who'd finally found unity in shared purpose. The hawthorn tree groaned under their collective weight as they hauled against the mechanical disadvantage of rope and stone and stubborn physics. Children too small to pull added their voices to the effort, creating a chorus that seemed to lift both rope and spirits toward the surface. Inch by painful inch, they rose through the limestone chimney. Sylva's shoulders bore scrapes that would scar for life, while her arms trembled with the effort of supporting a man twice her weight through passages carved for root systems rather than human bodies. But she held on with the same determination that had carried her through 7 winters of survival against impossible odds. The breakthrough came suddenly, Cornelius's head emerging into starlight, while hands reached down to grasp his arms and complete the rescue. But the effort of lifting him had wedged Sylva deeper into the chimney, her smaller frame caught between walls that seemed determined to claim at least one victim from the night's events. "The belt," Henrik shouted down the shaft. "Grab the cut belt, we'll haul you up the same way." But Sylva's hands were pinned against her sides, trapped by stone that had shifted during the final haul. Water bubbled up from the flooded chamber below, carrying with it the taste of minerals and the promise of drowning for anyone who couldn't complete their climb before the passage filled completely. Then the root chimney belched, a sound like the earth's own throat clearing as pressure equalized, and water found new paths through the disturbed limestone. The surge lifted Sylva toward the surface as hydraulic force accomplished what human strength could not, carrying her up through the narrow passage like a cork from a bottle. She emerged gasping and bleeding into a circle of faces illuminated by torchlight familiar strangers who had watched her from distance for years, but now saw her clearly for the first time. Henrik pressed his own cloak around her shoulders, while others offered water and words of gratitude that seemed inadequate for what had just occurred. Behind them, the root chimney sealed itself with a grinding finality that spoke of geological processes reclaiming spaces briefly open to human intrusion. The underground chamber system flooded completely, erasing all evidence of their desperate struggle except for the 3 lives that had been pulled from the earth's hungry embrace. Dawn found the village transformed not by the physical damage that could be repaired with stone and timber, but by the fundamental shift in how they understood their world and their place within it. The collapsed well sat like an open wound in the center of the square, but around it, people moved with the peculiar energy of those who had witnessed something beyond their previous experience. Davin Thornwick approached Sylva as she sat beside the cold ashes of the rescue fire, her borrowed cloak wrapped tight against the morning chill. In his hands, he carried the cut leather belt that had been recovered from the root chimney, scarred and water-stained, but intact. "This belongs to you," he said without preamble, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had marked their previous encounters. The leather showed dark stains where it had braced against stone and supported impossible weight, transformed from simple utility into something approaching artifact. Sylva accepted the belt with hands that still trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Kept us both alive," she replied simply, running her fingers over the scarred surface where rope had cut deep grooves. "Good leather learns from hard use." Around them, other conversations were reshaping the village's understanding of recent events. Henrik spoke with quiet authority to anyone who would listen, describing the techniques that had made rescue possible, the echolocation that had mapped invisible passages, the air current reading that had found their escape route, the patient instruction that had kept panic from claiming additional victims. "Never seen anything like it," he told a group gathered around the well's edge. "Girl reads stone like other folk read books," hears things the rest of us miss, sees connections we never imagined. Without her knowledge, he gestured toward the collapsed shaft, letting the implications speak for themselves. Thomas Milwright, pale but alert after his night in the depths, added his own voice to the growing chorus of witness. She sang to keep the fear away, he told his parents, his young face serious with the memory of terror transformed to hope. Like my grandmother used to do when storms came, made the darkness smaller somehow. The click he demonstrated, a perfect reproduction of Sylva's navigational technique, made several children laugh with delight rather than fear. What had been supernatural and threatening in rumor became merely clever when performed by one of their own, a technique that could be learned and practiced rather than feared and shunned. Old Henrik pressed something into Sylva's palm as she prepared to return to the ridge, a piece of white chalk, worn smooth by decades of use in marking measurements and depths. "The one who hears stone," he said formally, using words that carried the weight of official recognition. "The village remembers its debts." But it was Cornelius Blackwater who provided the most profound transformation in how the community understood their relationship with the wild lands beyond their borders. Still weak from his ordeal, he nevertheless insisted on addressing the gathered villagers with words that would echo long after the physical damage had been repaired. "She came down into the dark when she could have stayed safe on her ridge," he told them, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had stared death in the face and lived to describe it. "Shared her water when ours was gone, shared her knowledge when ours wasn't enough, used her own body as a bridge to bring me home to my family." He paused, looking directly at those who had spoken loudest about curses and supernatural threats. "If that's what you call a monster, then I pray for more monsters in this world. Because the real evil isn't in the wild places beyond our walls, it's in the fear that makes us forget our own humanity." The crowd stirred uneasily, processing implications that reached far beyond the immediate crisis. Stories that had grown in darkness and ignorance began to crumble under the weight of direct experience. The pale-eyed witch who stole breath became a woman who had shared her own air with strangers. The creature who commanded supernatural forces became a teacher who had patiently explained techniques that anyone could learn. Children who had been warned away from the ridge now begged their parents for lessons in echolocation and air current reading. Young hunters asked Henrik about the rope technique Sylva had demonstrated, eager to add wilderness skills to their traditional training. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, fear giving way to curiosity, suspicion replaced by tentative respect. Dawn's first light found Sylva standing at the boundary between village and wilderness, her feet planted on ground that belonged fully to neither world, but somehow encompassed both. The hedgerow behind her marked the unofficial border where cultivated land gave way to wild spaces, while ahead the village stirred to life around the wounded well that would need weeks to properly repair. The surveying work had begun before sunrise. Henrik and his team moved through the area with measuring ropes and chalk, mapping the extent of damage while incorporating the knowledge that Sylva had shared during the rescue. Her echo marks, scratched into stone according to techniques learned from cave-dwelling creatures, now formed part of their official survey, indicating stable passages and dangerous voids in the underground system. Sylva's breath, they had named the root chimney that had saved 3 lives, marking it on their maps with the reverence usually reserved for landmarks that had shaped generations of local history. The hawthorn tree above the passage received similar treatment, protected by village decree and surrounded by carefully maintained clear space that would allow future access if emergencies demanded it. But the most profound change lay in the quality of attention the villagers now brought to their daily interactions with the wild lands surrounding their settlement. Children who had once been forbidden to venture beyond the cultivated fields now received careful instruction in reading wind patterns and listening to the subtle voices of stone and stream. Adults who had viewed the forest as something to be conquered or feared began to understand it as a vast library of knowledge waiting to be learned. Sylva herself occupied a position that had no precedent in village history, neither fully accepted as resident nor completely relegated to outsider status. She remained wild by choice and temperament, returning each evening to the ridge where Nyx waited with the patient loyalty of pack bonds forged through shared survival. But she was no longer the creature of rumor and fear that had haunted their collective imagination. The trading post arrangement expanded beyond simple pelt-for-salt exchanges. Henrik had commissioned her to map the underground water systems that fed their wells, work that would require her unique combination of surface knowledge and subterranean navigation skills. Other villagers sought her instruction in wilderness techniques, not from desperation, but from recognition that her knowledge represented valuable skills their community had been lacking. Thomas Millwright proved especially eager to learn the clicking techniques that had guided them through darkness. His young voice mastered the acoustic patterns with the quick adaptability of childhood, adding percussion elements that turned navigation into a form of music. Other children followed his example, creating games that taught serious skills while maintaining the joy that made learning possible. "She's building a bridge," old Henrik observed to his wife one evening as they watched Sylva demonstrate air current detection to a group of fascinated youngsters. "Not the kind made of wood and stone, but something that connects our world to hers, makes both stronger." The observation proved prophetic. Within a month, techniques that had been exclusively wild began appearing in village practice hunters who used echolocation to track prey through dense forest, builders who read stone stress patterns the way Sylva had taught them, farmers who monitored air currents to predict weather changes with unprecedented accuracy. But Sylva's transformation was equally profound. Contact with human community had awakened hunger she had learned to suppress during her solitary years, the desire for shared purpose, for knowledge exchanged rather than hoarded, for the particular warmth that came from being needed rather than merely tolerated. She remained fundamentally wild, but wilderness now encompassed connection rather than excluding it. The Well Project became a collaboration that bridged multiple forms of knowledge. Cornelius brought decades of conventional engineering experience, while Sylva contributed understanding of natural water systems that no human survey had ever mapped. Together, they designed solutions that worked with underground currents rather than against them, creating infrastructure that would prove more durable than anything either could have achieved alone. On the night exactly 1 month after the collapse, the village held a dedication ceremony for the new wellhead. Not the simple stone structure they had originally planned, but an elaborate system that incorporated both traditional engineering and wilderness-derived innovations. Sylva stood beside the completed work, her pale eyes reflecting torchlight as children demonstrated the clicking techniques she had taught them, and adults spoke of sustainable relationships with the wild lands that surrounded their community. Nix waited at the forest edge, silver-furred and patient, ready to carry her human companion back to the ridge where they had learned to survive together. But the wolf showed no jealousy or concern about the bonds being forged between worlds. Pack loyalty encompassed growth rather than restricting it, understanding that strength came from adaptation rather than rigid adherence to previous patterns. As the ceremony concluded and villagers began returning to their homes, Sylva found herself surrounded by the particular silence that came after successful transformation, not the empty quiet of isolation, but the peaceful stillness of equilibrium achieved between competing forces. She was keeper of breath and stone and the spaces between heartbeats, guardian of knowledge that connected rather than divided, bridge builder in a world that had forgotten how different forms of wisdom could strengthen each other. The last torch guttered and died as she walked toward the ridge, leaving behind a village that slept more peacefully than it had in months. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns while below, humans and wolves and the patient earth itself prepared for whatever challenges the turning seasons might bring. The Breathkeeper had found her place, not in one world or the other, but in the space where both could flourish together. In the darkness, a child's voice practiced clicking rhythms that would help him navigate tomorrow's adventures, while somewhere on the ridge, a wolf howled contentment to the listening night. The bridge between worlds held strong, built not of stone and timber, but of courage, understanding, and the recognition that survival required cooperation rather than conquest. The wild lands breathed easier, and the village dreamed of deeper waters.